All right, we're here with Carissa Slaughterback, and we're going to be talking about public participation. So, Carissa, maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about what you do at the Hubert Humphrey Institute, et cetera.
I'm a professor in urban and regional planning at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs here at the University of Minnesota. There I do work related to environmental planning and policy and decision making with a particular focus on public and stakeholder engagement. I'm really interested in how people use information to make decisions, and particularly decisions related to engaging in public processes.
Yeah, wonderful. Do you think people are generally aware of what those processes are, or are they, from your experience, unaware and therefore need some education about these issues?
Yeah, it's really hard in many cases to figure out how to get engaged. I think these processes can be difficult to understand who has authority. It can be difficult to figure out where to get information about how to participate. The processes themselves and just what you would do as a participant can be daunting, it can be intimidating, it can be difficult to even determine how you might get engaged in a process. I think that's a big initial barrier, just in building that understanding about what those opportunities are to get engaged.
So how do people tend to get that information? Say somebody that has become very effective in the public domain, working as a citizen in a particular issue. Is it the kind of thing they tend to get through experience trying this and this doesn't work? Or are there other forms of public education as far as how to engage in public processes?
Yeah, I think that certainly it's easier to get information about this now than it has been at any other time. More information is available online. You can go to agency websites, community websites, nonprofit organizations sometimes have information about how to engage on particular processes. That can be one way to get engaged or to gather the information that one would need to figure out, well, where do I really start? Is there a meeting I can attend? How do I get information about this project? Who has decision-making authority? What's the basis for the decision? I think online information can be really helpful. I think another angle on this is to think about the responsibility that agencies and decision-making organizations have in building that capacity for people to get engaged and to really think about reaching out to that public, not just posting information on a website to say, hey, there's going to be a meeting, it's going to be on Thursday at 5 o'clock at this location, but to really identify folks who might be interested, public, stakeholders who might be interested in an issue, topic, policy, whatever it might be, reach out to them early in the process, build that relationship, provide information that the public and stakeholders need to be effective participants in that process. What's the nature of the decision-making process? Are there certain meetings that might be happening? Is there a way to get information? Is there a listserv, for example, that you could sign up for to get ongoing information about a process? I think that, to me, as I think about the role of government, responsibilities that of urban planners and folks that I'm teaching and interact with on an ongoing basis, that's a key responsibility that I think exists within government to provide that information, make it accessible, make it clear how people can participate effectively.
Sure, that's wonderful. It brings to mind when you mention online sources of information, a listserv, et cetera, the ways in which perhaps the way that some of these issues are mediated has changed in your experience. Which raises a question before we get into some of the more applied questions, what works, what doesn't work from your perspective. Communication studies is often very interested, not just in the sort of transmittive issues of communication, there's a sender and receiver, but also the constitutive, the way in which a form of communication can itself create certain knowledges and change things. In particular, as you've seen agencies struggle or adapt to putting information online and trying to figure out how do you reach a public in a world where it's no longer assumed that you put it out in the local newspaper or everybody's sharing the same media, has that changed the way people get this information and made it more problematic or more effective? Or?
I think it's moving toward greater effectiveness. I think if we're just, simply putting a notice in a newspaper, we realize we're going to miss a whole lot of people. How many people get newspapers at their home? Especially are people reading newspapers that are specific to their local jurisdiction? Do we even have newspapers in some jurisdictions to be able to post that information? I think putting it online gives greater access, but we also need to acknowledge, will people even have the knowledge to go to a website? Will they know it exists? Will they know what information might be there? Will they know how to use it? Are there people that we're missing by putting information online? And as we look at digital divide, are there certain populations that simply don't have access to the internet, don't have access to a device to be able to access a website, documents, large documents that require download, for example? Will people be able to even access that? And that's a really important consideration, especially as we look at historically underrepresented populations. And are we further marginalizing these groups by putting lots and lots of information online and assuming that everyone's going to get there? Yeah. I think looking at multiple techniques, ways to get information out about opportunities to engage is really the way to go. And the web has certainly enhanced that, provides new opportunities, but has to be coupled with other forms as well.
Sure, thank you. Well, let's get into some of those practical issues. I'm sure in various hearing contexts, in every public participation process, you've probably seen those things where you think, that might not be the most effective way for that person to be able to represent their view in public. What are some of those? Let's get those on the table. What are some of the mistakes you often see?
Yeah, I talk about this a lot with the class that I teach on public participation. And so we talk about the very basic expectations that often exist in state statute or in city codes about the very minimal levels of public engagement that we often have to have. So we often have very sort of judicial formats as we're looking at city council meetings or planning commission meetings. Even state commissions and state agency decision-making bodies often have processes that can be quite intimidating. They can be quite formal. In many cases, you have to sign up in advance if you want to make comments. You may have a very limited time during which to make comments. The time on an agenda may be quite limited during which comments might be made. And there may be an expectation that you're behaving in a certain way that may be completely unfamiliar. Formal sort of acknowledgement of who's in the room. Council chair, council members, I'm here to talk about this. It can be very formal, it can be very intimidating, often detracts from the real opportunity to share the perspectives that you have. And again, I think often there can be a time limit that's associated with it. You get 2 minutes to speak, the next person is queuing up behind you. There's a lot of pressure and a lot of unfamiliarity with that kind of environment that can make it intimidating and probably results in some people not having the opportunity to be there.
Yeah, it raises a question for me. We often have students look at a lot of different videos from scoping hearings and that kind of thing and assess what do you think was more effective. And there's two things that often come to mind. One, you get different people seeing different levels of effectiveness, say the more impassioned response versus the more intellectual response, et cetera. Does what tends to work for the audience, is that always the same thing that what works for what Robert Cox, the textbook author, might call the primary audience, the policymakers you want to influence? Is there a disconnect sometimes between what works for one and the other, or do you find it's pretty much the same thing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, certainly when you have a lot of passion, when there may be a high conflict kind of situation or topic, generating that emotion, kind of getting the crowd behind you and sort of rallying them to action can be exciting. It can sort of, you might presume that it can affect decision makers, but I don't really know if it does. Yeah. And in some cases, it may feel overwhelming. It may feel, not evidence-based. So I'm not so sure. I think it is important to acknowledge, what's the basis for the decision maker's decision? What within law can they actually consider as evidence as they make their decisions? Sometimes, it's relatively open. Sometimes it's quite specific parameters under which they can make a decision. And I think really thinking carefully about how to respond to those, understanding those in advance, so that you can make the argument with the information, with the perspective, with the passion, hopefully as well, in order to be able to have the influence that you want to have.
Yeah, it sounds like you almost, to a certain extent, want to remind people that have a certain empathy for the policymaker as a person as well. That they're not just sort of the people you're trying to convince of something. Yeah.
Right.
What seem to be some of the most effective communication strategies you've seen in your experience? So if we talked about some of the mistakes that you see sometimes, what have been some moments that stand out or techniques that stand out as very effective?
Yeah, I think, again, more so than ever, I think people can get information. I think, with relatively little effort, you can gather information about a project proposal or a policy. having that information in mind, being as knowledgeable as you can, acknowledging that people actually have limited time to spend on these things, you can gather a fair amount of information, and to be able to come with some knowledge of what's being proposed can be helpful in making an effective argument. Coming with some knowledge of the decision-making process and understanding what kind of comments at this particular point in time with this particular audience is going to be most effective. I think asking advice from staff maybe within that organization, within the city, who may be able to give you some insights as to what might be effective, what would be an effective argument, what evidence or information might be well received by the decision-making body in this case. Just practically, how does it work to stand up and give that testimony or share that information? Can you submit evidence in written form if you don't want to stand up? I think getting advice, gathering information, just being as prepared as possible for the environment in which you're going to be. I think connecting with folks who have similar views and ensuring that they're there as well. I think many voices sharing the same information, reinforcing each other's perspectives can be influential as well. Seeing bodies in the room, seeing folks making the same argument, adding to the base of evidence that decision-making body would need to consider, I think is another strategy.
And I imagine you've seen all kinds of contexts for public participation, from the sort of interpersonal engagement all the way up to, I keep bringing it back to that large scoping hearing or something. I think my relatively superficial experience with it calls to mind those sort of more public events. One of the things I've really enjoyed in these interviews is talking to people about their actual experiences. As I've been asking you about these, have any particular events come to mind where you've seen processes that you could tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, one sort of vivid memory that I have, I was working as an urban planner in Nevada, and Nevada is home to, well, not home yet, but has been proposed as the home for a national nuclear waste facility at Yucca Mountain.
Yeah.
And I remember being a local planner working for a city, kind of paying attention to what was happening there, and watching a televised public hearing related to Yucca Mountain. And I think it started in mid-afternoon, and it just continued as long as it needed to continue until everyone had an opportunity to comment. So folks had to sign up in advance. They each had 2 minutes to share their comments. They had to walk up to a microphone. And I think the most vivid memory there, certainly comments, lots of passion and information and evidence being presented on both sides, but to watch the facilitator sort of continue to become exhausted and perspiring and loosening his tie as 8 hours sort of accumulated into late in the evening. And to think, he was on the screen continuously and you could sort of watch that happen. But to think about the experience of being there as a participant and thinking, okay, I'm number 512 speaker, and my 2 minutes are coming up at some point in the future. And to think about the burden that creates for participants, is that the format that's
or
most
the facilitator?
Effective? Right, yeah.
Exhausting.
For sure. And I think to just think about, is there a better way to do that?
Yeah.
Certainly having the right to stand up in front of your peers, in front of a decision-making body and share your perspective can be empowering and it can be important. But when you have a project that is national, it's large scale, it's extremely high conflict, is there a better way to be able to do that? I think that's an important question as we think about these very sort of legal, judicial kinds of decision-making environments and other tools that might be available.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so that's one that comes to mind. I think, as an urban planner and someone who studies in particular collaborative processes, I think looking at ways that we can engage a cross-section of potential stakeholders early in the process and on an ongoing basis, not sort of waiting till we have something to put in front of them and say, hey, what do you think?
A conflict that's boiled up. Yeah.
Right. I think to be able to think about building those relationships, convening a group that can work with each other over a period of time, flesh out their perspectives, identify information that they need to be able to inform their perspective, gather that information, review it, figure out, what is a legitimate basis for making this decision, have that interaction and relationship building with decision makers and stakeholders build up over time. There's a lot of focus on social learning and the social learning that happens through that interaction, through that sort of one-to-one communication as folks are sitting around a table, and also just communicating with each other on breaks or when they're having lunch, and building those relationships, sharing their perspectives, communicating about their experience and where their particular perspective comes from can be really, really powerful. And I've seen, firsthand examples of how that can move a group forward and get a group toward consensus and really inform effective decisions.
Well, that's maybe we can leave on that. I asked one more question.
Yeah.
As you were talking about Yucca Mountain, it really made me think of Dana Lyons, who's one of my informants. And he cut his teeth as a movement activist, and I studied musicians 4 decades ago, opposing a DOE proposal to dump nuclear waste at Hanford. And I think we're all pretty glad that happened, given that it's already the largest Superfund site just based on military nuclear. But very much so, I think his whole life he's experienced that frustration that things get taken care of at the end when there's a sort of that conflict. What would be that sort of positive example or model where you would say, we need more of that collaborative process that you're talking about? Have you experienced sort of a successful outcome you'd really like to put forth?
Yeah, I think another one comes from my experience and practice, and it's definitely been informative to my work as an academic, and that's an example that's around an endangered species listing that happened also in Nevada. There's a lot of interesting things that happen in Nevada somehow.
We need a field course that goes to Nevada.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think one interesting thing there's just so many interests coming together, and it was an area in significant transition at this time, urbanization happening at a pace that we don't typically see in the U.S. And so we have the listing of the desert tortoise as an endangered species, and the impacts that has across a wide range of jurisdictions, across a wide range of lifestyles and recreation practices and agency jurisdiction and priority is really, really interesting. And so with the listing of the desert tortoise, they established a really extensive stakeholder group. I think 40 or 50 different interests represented there, from scientific interests to governmental agency interests. You had the Air Force, because they own land there and had large habitat areas. You had cities, you had counties, you had advocacy groups, you had kind of economically oriented groups like gold miners and ranchers and recreation interests as well, all coming together, all with concerns about the listing. Whether it's a good thing, is it a bad thing, how is this going to affect me and people like me and my interests? And to have an opportunity as a planner to be able to participate in that process was really an extremely interesting process, to watch these folks come together, to have conversations, to share information about where do their perspectives come from is really, really interesting. And to be able to generate a process that allows that to happen, that isn't about people standing up and talking for 5 minutes and saying, when I grew up, things were like this and I want them to stay like this forever. It was more about the experiences that people had, the relationships that people had with their resources, which, could be perceived as good or bad for the desert tortoise. Creating space for that to happen, creating the relationships and the trust among the folks who are in the room to be able to have those conversations, feel comfortable sharing where their perspective comes from, ultimately defining a problem that needed to be addressed, and then getting to a set of decisions to be able to mitigate, protect habitat, ensure that fewer desert tortoises are impacted by development or recreation or whatever, was really, really interesting.
Well, wonderful. Well, it's also wonderful to end on a positive example.
Yeah.
So let's finish there. Thank you very much, Carissa. All right, we're here with Rod Squires. And Rod, tell us a little bit about what you do in the Department of Geography.
Well, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Society and Environment. No, Geography, Environment and Society. We changed our name 2 years ago from geography to be more encompassing, to fit in with the modern paradigms, idioms of education, or whatever you want to call it. So I'm associate professor there. I've been there 40 years. Long time. I've grown old here.
Oh, nice. Okay. Well, maybe a brief overview of your research interests and experiences as it relates to environmental communication. I know that you've been
at the center of a lot of different environmental issues, debates, procedures. So a little bit about your research interests and experience.
Well, you know, when I first came here, I was a paleoecologist, which means I was interested in vegetational history and climate change and human interference on vegetation. And then I decided I didn't want to look down a microscope anymore. So I educated myself in the way in which the government of the United States works, so basically public policy and law. And that's really what I've been teaching the last 15, 20 years, is public policy, legal issues, from a social scientist perspective. But I'm particularly interested in land ownership issues and the history of land ownership, particularly in the Midwest. So, you know, that's where most of my research efforts go, is on trying to understand early settlement, if you like, a lot of the land ownership. Talk about land ownership. So I teach courses on public policy, both the federal level and the state level. And what I'm interested in doing there is getting students to look at the original documents, to look at the statutes, look at the legislation, rather than look at articles where authors talk about legislation.
Yeah.
And so they get the original materials, and I force them to read it and analyze it and things like that. Same with the regulations and court cases. I kind of force them to read that. And then I teach a course on real estate, which really is looking at the history and current practices regarding land ownership. And I focus on the metropolitan area and take students out to various county officials and people that work in the real estate business. I don't teach a course on how to buy and sell real estate, but I teach on what land ownership has meant in American history and American geography.
Oh, wonderful. Well, you seem to be fairly uniquely situated then to think about how question of public participation, communicating with publics, and then communicating with policymakers. Are there any suggestions or thoughts you've had having done that in your lifetime about how to communicate to those different audiences?
Well, the difficulty is, of course, at any research, there's lots of details about the research, and there's a framework that in a sense poses the questions that we gather the details to answer. And I found that by and large, many people don't want to know the details. They want to know the framework. They're comfortable with that. They want a sound bite, if you like. So they give them the framework. As soon as you delve into the details, their eyes glaze over and they fall asleep. So a lot of my work actually is with land surveyors and city engineers and people like that are interested in the way in which the land was divided up and the history of that. I'm not a surveyor, so but the work I do tries to inform surveyors about the material they use and how they go about doing their work, because whether they like it or not, the modern surveyor is what we call following in the footsteps of the earliest surveyors. And really, state law says that the modern day surveyors have to follow the monuments that were set, or the stakes in the ground that were set by those early people in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. So, you know, a lot of my communication is either to a general audience like students, or to an audience that doesn't know much about surveying. And then to surveyors who really want the details, and I'm not comfortable about all the details because I don't know some of the details of surveying. I mean, that's really quite a scientific, mathematical sort of do. So, you know, you have to wear several hats. And what I like putting myself in uncomfortable positions. So I was involved in a couple of court cases that we mentioned before we came on air, and that's another interesting experience, because in front of a class or even in front of when you're doing a lecture in front of professionals, you can expound on various things. You can let your mouth run away with you sometimes. when you're in a legal situation, that's a no-no. And so it's really a very, very particular sort of experience. Now, I haven't testified too much in too many public hearings, but the same would be the same thing. In other words, limit yourself to particular issues that you think are important. But I'm curious now how those issues are important cascade into other issues that are somewhat less important. I'm not... Any questions that can be answered with a soundbite intrinsically aren't worth asking, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with modern communication as a whole. Everybody wants a soundbite. Dan Gunderson called me up, who's a correspondent for NPR. He called me up the day before I think it was the White Earth Band were going to go wild ricing out of season, and they'd been threatened that they were going to be all sued. And he obviously was looking for a soundbite, about it, because he knew I'd done some work on with the Mille Lacs bands and then some Michigan bands, and I'd just written an article actually on that Mille Lacs case for a rural Minnesota journal. So he got my name somehow, and I knew he was looking for a soundbite, and I just really didn't give him one.
Yeah. He
for
was
a whole
hoping to
variety
get a
of
simple
reasons.
he said, she said sort of contest.
Yeah,
And it was more nuanced
yeah, I
and
think so. And,
complex,
and he'd already been talking to the attorney for the bands and things like this. So he had some sound bites, but he was looking for a different one, and I wasn't about it. I didn't give him one. I was quite proud of myself, because normally I would expound at length if somebody said, "Tell me about what you think."
And then he'd turn it into a soundbite.
Yeah, then he would turn it out. So I
Right.
didn't give him anything. So that was. But so there are lots of audiences, and of course you have to tailor your remarks to audiences. One of the real problem areas, of course, when you don't know your audience, when you get asked to give a talk, say after dinner. In fact, I have to give a talk. I belong to a dining faculty club, and I have to give a talk in December. That's at the Christmas meeting. They're all going to be. So it's going to be interesting to figure out what I talk about, what I tell them, and what I don't tell them. So it's going to be an interesting pitch. But I do it deliberately again, because I'm out of my comfort zone there. I'm not an after-dinner speaker.
Right.
I need PowerPoints. I need to know what I'm talking about. And after dinner,
not
when
the
you're relaxing,
Toastmasters
is
sort of, yeah.
So that'll be interesting to see
Yeah.
how I communicate. And they're all bright people. They're all faculty members or emeritus members of the faculty. So they're going to want to know detail and framework. So I'm going to have to work hard on that. So, but again, communication, as you know, as you go through the university, introductory courses require different levels of communication than senior courses and things like that. I wish it wasn't the case, because the answers to questions don't vary depending on the level you're at in a university.
More in terms of what you can say.
That's right. What we know about a particular issue.
You nicely tied together three things, I think: public participation, law, and also news, in the sense that one thing they share in common is there is that sort of preset framework that you have to know in some cases what is and is not possible, and what are the magic words.
Yeah.
For example, the students are doing this thing called a
public participation game, where they, if you don't know the right legal term or the right policy-oriented term for a scoping hearing, no matter how brilliant your argument, you're not going to advance. On the other hand, as you point out, the issues themselves are much more complicated.
Yeah.
And I'd like to use that as a segue to talk about something that I know you know quite a little bit about, the Boundary Waters canoe area. It's a situation that I think most of us go there and think, well, this has always been here. Yeah. Naturally, it's just like this now. But if you know much about it, you realize there's this whole history, legislative history, and I imagine communication played a large role in that. Can you tell us anything about that particular case as far as how that developed and maybe what role communication played?
Well, you're right. I mean, we forget that the national forests, national parks, wilderness areas weren't always there. Some have been there longer than others. Yellowstone, 1873. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area was created. It's a land management unit in many respects within the National Forest, Superior National Forest, in 1964. If one looks before 1964, there was a lot of commercial exploitation going on. In fact, in the early part of the 20th century, there were plans, or 1910, 1920, there were plans to dam up all those boundary waters to create water power for what was presumed to be a thriving paper industry. That was blocked in the end by, I think, a combination of state and federal actions. But it's interesting, if you read the Wilderness Act of 1964, of course nobody usually reads the original act, they read what people say about the original act. You'll realize that that piece of legislation, like most pieces of legislation, was a compromise, and the language in the actual act reflects the compromise, because the Boundary Waters Canoe Area was specifically excluded from full wilderness protection. I mean, in one of the clauses, and I've forgotten the actual number, people can have a look at the 1964 Act, they talk about mining, motorized transportation, and logging will not be excluded from the wilderness. Now, how you go from the definition of wilderness as an area untrammeled by humans to logging, motorized transportation, and mining baffles the imagination. But in a sense, it's what had to be done to get the approval of the Minnesota legislative bodies at that point, or legislative people at that point in time. So it was a compromise. So between 1964 and 1978, when
there was a particular piece of legislation that focused particularly on the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, which specifically excluded commercial logging from much of the interior part, excluded mining from the area, and curtailed a lot of motorized transportation. There was a lot of controversy, and a lot of court cases were involved. And many of the Friends of the Wilderness, was it Friends of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, I think, the whole number of wilderness advocates who were fighting those battles, saying how stupid it is to have wilderness where you can have logging. And some of those cases went to the Supreme Court, most went to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. And there's still some issues about people. For example, I believe there are a number of private mineral interests in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area. In fact, the state also has not only mineral interests, it has surface interests within the wilderness area, and at the moment the Forest Service and the Department of Natural Resources are trying to do a swap so that the state will acquire the land the feds will acquire the land in the state lands in the wilderness area, and the state will acquire lands outside the wilderness area in the National Forest area in lieu of those lands. And that's been an ongoing battle for 10, 15, 20 years to get that. And so, all management units, whether it be a small management unit like, say, the Point 2 National Wildlife Refuge in Mille Lacs, or the 1.2 million acre BWC, they're all they have a history of controversy and literally compromise. And one of the things that I try and point out when I teach and do research on this is that these are not historical accidents. They're not historical accidents, and if we're not careful, we'll lose them. For example, it's my firm belief that if we have copper nickel mining or the proposed mining, it will destroy. How badly, I don't know, but it will destroy the wilderness. It will destroy the wilderness properties. And so, but again, it comes to a compromise between wilderness and jobs, and and that I don't go there.
Yeah.
Although I talk about policy, I'm not paid well enough to come up with the answers. and the vilification that comes with that, or the praise that comes with that.
Right,
so
right.
I just try and paint the dimensions of the problem and say, there's the problem, it has to be solved. These are the stakeholders. Here's what they're saying. You have to decide yourself. I don't live in Ely, so in a sense, I have no horse in the race, except I'm a member of the community. So I want to see the Boundary Waters Canoe Area there. I don't personally go up there, but I have friends that are, and they like it, love it, and it's certainly a star in our outdoor recreational arena, so to speak.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you showing up today to talk about these issues. Really went across the board, and even in the end there got as far as conflict resolution, which is a whole other ball of wax. I think as you present as scholars, maybe we sometimes don't want to get involved in that. So
well, we can't. Our role is it seems to me, we can give an opinion, of course we all do in classes, but we have to try and frame any issue in the broadest possible way, so students that from the right or the left or central, or students that don't know anything or students that know everything, can make up their minds by the evidence you present or the evidence you leave out. We're not dispassionate members after all, but on the other hand, we do have an obligation, I think, to present the stuff that's out there and accessible.
yeah, makes sense. Well, thank you so much.
Okay.